Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to Cocktails and Rocktails with me, your most notorious groupie, Allison Rouse, author of this little book right here. These other little books, where you can get those down in that description. Hit that link tree, fiddle about, use your fingers, and check it out. And as always, just thank you guys so much for just really being patient, for really just hanging on and being cool through my little roller coaster of emotions here. So thank you so much just for being an amazing family, for being very cool. Welcome to all the new people. Feel free to ask any questions. I will answer it. I am slowly but surely answering all the comments. I have about 100 to catch up on, so I'm getting to you if I haven't got to you yet. So thank you so much for your patience. Truly appreciate it, you guys, so much. And today's topic, because we know a lot about the 70s groupies, that they're like the only groupies that are really talked about by other people. We know a little bit about the 80s groupies that we've seen here, about the Sunset Strip. Very limited part of the 80s, but us 80s ladies are bringing that out, talking more about it. But what's one area that's not really talked about that much is the 90s. I know a lot of people believe what they said in Rolling Stone, the grunge guys in the interviews and stuff, that, oh no, we don't do the groupie thing. Oh, the fuck you didn't, Eddie Vedder. Really, Eddie Vedder? As I always used to say. But yeah, I mean, the 90s, it was this kind of strange, like, open door, threshold that wasn't really stepped over yet. Musically, things were changing. The groupie scene was changing, but was it dead? No, I don't think it was. At least not for me and my friends. Because, I think groupie kind of just kept going. But it was more under the radar type of thing. But we're going to talk about that today. And today we are going to have revision. This is jogging like my 90s. Jogging like my 90s. What the fuck? What do you mean jogging like? I don't think anybody was jogging in the 90s. Half the musicians were too hopped up on heroin. You couldn't jog on heroin. You couldn't even make it down to the Moore Cafe for mashed potatoes. But anyway, we're going to have this. This is a hazy IPA. We're going to check it out. Revision is an awesome brew house. So everybody, grab your 90s, kick up your feet, and let's have a little cocktails and rocktails. Woohoo! Alright, let's see what this is going to taste like. Cheers, big ears! Ooh, that's actually interesting. I'm not like, I think IPAs got really overrun there for a while, so I kind of don't really, some IPAs, like I said, the IBU standard, it can be really bitter. So I tend to stay away from a lot of, I don't know what this is. This is only 24 on the IBU. So this is a pretty low. I guess that's why I like it. It's a 6.8 alcohol, but yeah, not bitter, has kind of, not a spice, but kind of a smooth, creamy flavor all at the same time. It's actually really good, and I really like it. I like that first drink that I had, so might see me drinking more of it through the whole episode. Who knows? But let's get into it. So, being a groupie in the 90s, I know that all the grunge guys and all their interviews were like, "We're still not into groupies." Oh, the fuck you weren't. Please. Having lived in Seattle in the 90s, but also lived in Las Vegas and a little bit in Salt Lake City in the 90s, I can say in Salt Lake City at the beginning of the 90s, we were still 100% full on into the scene. The rock stars were calling us. We were established. We were hanging out. Debauchery, while not as immense, as big as it used to be in the 80s, it was kind of mellowed out. But it was still there. People were still having fun. People were still hooking up. People were still drinking. There was still a little bit of drug use going on, let's face it. So it was kind of this limbo area between the 80s and the last really great groupie scenes, because there weren't any groupie scenes. There weren't like, oh my God, like, the Sunset Strip in California, or Salt Lake City, the groupie capital of the world, according to the rock stars. I didn't name it that. the smaller towns like Chicago or Houston or New York or Atlanta or Florida, wherever, see, there wasn't really, well, Seattle never really had a groupie scene until, because that groupie scene was totally different, but we're going to get into that in a minute. So there wasn't like really prevalent groupie scenes like there had been before. I think the 90s kind of became more about establishing relationships, with different women in different parts of the world, or, let's say the drummer Scott, that hired hand drummer for Judas Priest, that actually been the longest drummer they've had. He would have like his American woman, his South American woman, his Euro woman, and I think a Japanese woman. So the 90s kind of became more that. Yeah, they still had their random hookups here and there, but you could refrain. Everybody wasn't as horny as they were in the 80s when it came to the 90s. So there was still groupie scenes, but it wasn't like the crazy, wild, groupie scenes of everybody, hooking up, everybody getting laid. Even Sweet Connie was mellowing out, even though she was still very much active in the 90s. So it was just kind of, like I said, in this limbo. It was still a good time. It was still party. There was still laughter. There was still sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But heroin entered the picture. So it kind of took the sex drive a little down, as it does. But, and for me, I already knew a lot of bands. So I was already established. I had already created, long time friendships with previous bands, but of the 80s and the early 90s. But then, like I said, the early 90s started happening, grunge, thrash. So there was still a lot of really cool bands. Thrash was still prevalent. Grunge, there was all these new bands to meet. So went out, and yes, I met those bands. We all know about Eddie Vedder and Deviate. We all know that I've hung out with Owen from My Sister's Machine, with the guys from Alice in Chains. I had to babysit the guys in STP. There was still a groupie scene. Like, it was still kind of expected and not rejected and not a dirty little secret. It was still, oh yeah, there's still a groupie scene. Cool beans. So I think it just became kind of, in the 90s, the rockers and the groupies were kind of searching for something a little different. They may have just a one-night stand, but it's a one-night stand every time that band goes on tour. Plus, the tours sort of changed. They went from like 5 shows a week, the band's constantly going and going and going, to maybe 2 or 3. So you might have a couple shows in a row, then you have a day off, then you play a show, then you might have a couple days off, then you have a couple more. As to where in the 80s it was like show, day off, show, travel day. Show, and it was constant. So, and I think that they just kind of wanted to be a little bit more mellow, and when I went to Seattle, I did find the groupie scene very, very different. It's like every one of the girls was like, oh, I'm dating this guy in this band. Whether it was a local band, which could have been huge, like Alice in Chains, or like Green Apple Quick Step. A lot of people didn't know them, but we did, or My Sister's Machine, or Rhino Humpers, or the Rhino Humpers definitely were anybody down at PPU. The first time when Danny and I were up there in 1990, when grunge, Mother Love Bone, Andrew had just passed away, before they'd become, Pearl Jam, but Alice in Chains had just got signed. They were just starting club tours around the U.S. and to open up for, do all the different tours and start becoming who they were. They were just on the ground level. So the first time we were there, I don't think that they saw a groupie scene like we did, like we had in Salt Lake City or L.A. or stuff, where we were just all balls out. Woo! It was just a little more relaxed, kick back, because first time and second time I was there, beginning of grunge and at the height of grunge, the girls were like, oh yeah, I haunt this guy in this band, and like, Blacken or Stepfather or whatever, or Talks Cheap, Talks Weak, or whatever you wanted to call him. So they were haunting them. They were the girlfriend of this guy, but they weren't the only girlfriend. It's just open. It's just what it is. But I haunt him. I'm not a groupie. you're a groupie, you just gave it a different name, because ghosting back then was something totally different. Haunting him was like, oh yeah, we hang. We fuck around once in a while, we drink. When the band comes through town, I'm his girl. So it was a very different kind of attitude towards it because of what the bands were saying in their interviews, that it was degrading to women, even though in the 80s we empowered it. We owned it. Everybody was balls out that yes, we are here to be groupies. Groupies are loved. We are wanted. We are part of the road life. We are part of the rock experience. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. And new girls could still come along and enjoy the groupie life, but I think it was for the girls in the 90s, I think they did a lot less than what we did in the 80s, not like sexually or stuff like that. Like, I think they did do some touring, but not as much. Like, there was kind of a disconnect with the groupie scene that way. But at the same time, rockers were still very into it. They just didn't talk about it. Not even among themselves. Like in the 80s, it was always, oh my God, did you hear about last night? Metallica and the Tub Tarts and that girl with the open bottle of champagne and all this stuff. Like it was a big hot topic. Everybody was bragging about it the next day, from the roadies to the rock stars to the musician, the groupies. It was no holds barred. They were talking about it in interviews. But in interviews when in the 90s, they were like, oh no. It was just something they did not talk about. And the look even changed. Like in the 80s, early 90s, the 80s, of course, we had the metal rock chick look. But we kind of still had our own style too. And especially going into the early 90s, we were dressing more like Vogue. We were shopping at Nordstrom, which was, the most high-end store we could get in Salt Lake City. We were doing our own thing as far as fashion is concerned. Once we broke out of the spandex and the Aquanet, and we found our own styles. We were very much our own women. As to kind of in the 90s, it all of a sudden had this look of somewhere between thrash metal with the tight black jeans. Even I wore those, and combat boots or heels with the concert t-shirt, or the more goth look, or the total Seattle grunge look with the dark lipstick and just, not a whole lot of eye makeup and stuff, the kind of the cat eye, so even the look of groupie was changing, and so was the attitude. It was like people were getting a little more frigid at the time. And not necessarily frigid sexually, but emotionally, mentally. Like, they weren't going to be as available unless they had some sort of end game. Not like financially, not like I want to marry, but maybe marry a rock star. But, the girls just sort of started wanting more. So when I moved back up to Seattle and, started hanging out with Andrea and Jana and stuff and different, new groupies to the scene, I brought that more devil may care attitude. They're going to be out of town tomorrow. Next band's coming in town, take a number type of attitude. So Seattle had not seen that in the scene before. So when I came onto the scene with my friends, and I'm not saying like, oh my God, I was this big influencer and the it girl and all this stuff. I already knew most of the bands in Seattle before I moved up there. They were on tour too. Lollapalooza. They played Salt Lake. They played Denver. They played wherever I was, hanging out at the time. So I was already established, so it was a lot easier for me, but it was a lot more attractive because there wasn't the big Seattle fog hanging on to the groupie scene with me and my friends, as there were other girls, because they were believing what the guys said in the interviews, and that, oh yeah, the groupie scene, it doesn't exist anymore. We're not into that. The fuck you are. Or else somebody would have been punching my car window in when the guys in Pearl Jam were sitting in my car in Salt Lake City, smoking weed and getting ready to go fuck Eddie Vedder after he had kissed me in front of the whole club. Anyway, while he was climbing. But anyway, that story's down there. Go find it. So I just think, and it did kind of shift the attitude, like guys were just more comfortable not being judged by their peers, like the road crew and the other band guys. Like, there was one guy that I was younger than me that I dated on the crew, that when we would see each other, I would just, like, he would open his room door and he would hide behind the door, and because he didn't want anybody else talking about him on the crew. He didn't want anybody else being like, oh my God, well, you got a woman at home, which I didn't know about. But apparently he had one, then he didn't have one, then anyway. But he wrote a whole book too. I see you, Phil. So, anyway, So it was getting that kind of attitude, like they had to hide their groupie exploits because it was so looked down on by the public, because the public was believing the grunge guys, that they didn't get into the groupie scene when they actually did. But then, I moved to Vegas in 1995, and I tell you what, that was the place for the groupie scene because it was Vegas. And at the time when I moved to Vegas, the Hard Rock was just opening, like, and it was a huge grand opening party with like Jack Nicholson and I mean, just tons of actors and rock stars. Everybody was there, and it kind of kept that vibe going. And that was groupie in the 90s for me. Again, I already knew the guys, so I had long-term established relationships. Like Vincent Paul and I got together in 95 in Seattle, April of 95. And he wasn't ever ashamed of it, but we would always be off in our own little world. Because Pantera kind of came from the hedonism and rock and roll. They were right on that cusp of the limbo, that change in the shift. So, and plus musicians came to Vegas for a good time, not just on tour, so it was a lot easier. Living in Seattle obviously made it a lot easier for me to be around the musicians. Like I said, some of them there I already knew, so I was introduced into the scene very easily, but I was still very looked down upon, and the girlfriends of the local girlfriends of the musicians, were one of whatever 5 girls that they were haunting at the time, Jerry Cantrell, were always giving me dirty looks, or like I was, because I lived it out loud and I didn't make any excuses, or I didn't call myself a muse or the ghost or haunting him or anything, and thinking I was the only one. It's like John Entwistle's plethora of harem women he on the road. So many of them hate me but they get along with each other, and I don't know why, because they didn't know about each other and they all thought they were the only one. And it was that same kind of attitude that was brought to the 90s scene, and especially in Seattle. And it's like, oh no, you're not the only one. I've been out there in the rest of the world with them. You are not the only one. Mm. But I think in the 90s, it just kind of became more of a shame that people kind of hid only in Vegas. Because like I said, when it came to Vegas, oh yeah, Vegas was still kind of the hedonism of the 80s. You could drink, you could do drugs, you could go to the swingers club, you could go to the strip club, you could gamble, you could do all the debauchery, and it was okay because it was Vegas. So that kind of worked to my advantage as well, living in Vegas. But I really do think like the 90s for me, it was more, and for a lot of the new groupies as well, it was kind of more emotionally, mentally intimate than not just, the physical intimacy. There was, and I had already built a lot of those relationships with guys, so it kind of just progressed. Like I say, for me it just progressed with age, how the age not only that I was becoming, but how many years I had into the groupie scene and knowing the bands and stuff, and they were someone that you trusted. And I always say that, groupies traditionally throughout history have been the portal in the storm for all the rock guys. But in the 90s, I think that's they really wanted more than anything, was that port in the storm. That girl to rely on, that woman to be themselves with, to help them through their neuroses or whatever, their addictions and stuff like that. Because like I said, it kind of became a different scene with the heroin. And there became a whole few other things to take care of your man when you were a groupie. And there wasn't these 2 a.m. party, after show, after bus, like parties like in the 80s. If the band was leaving town, they were only in town for that day. Then there would just be all out getting drunk, picking a partner, having a fucking orgy on the bus, going into whatever nook and cranny you could, in the janitor's closet, in the Salt Palace, going wherever you could to get off before you get out of town, right? And everybody was just partying, getting drunk, and it was just, everybody knew what was going on and everybody was okay with it. But in the 90s, I think while that was still going on to an extent, like I think especially because strippers were more mainstream, it was more like strippers hanging out on the bus after the show, maybe some masturbation going on, circle jerk with the strippers in the middle, and cool, see you next time we're in town type of thing. And then the guys going to to bed without having to dirty their bunk sock type of thing. So I think that was kind of the more debauchery. The debauchery was definitely mellowing out rather than three girls going in to the back lounge with the drummer and the singer and just doing a, I don't know if I'm correct on this saying, because I guess for a lot of years, a Rochambeau, I don't know if I know what it means correctly. Tell me in the comments. I'm still naive to some things because it's just, that's me. So yeah, basically, while there was all these changes going on behind the scenes, it still wasn't, completely corporate and protected, and yet it was still kind of this world that existed in the way that I always talk about Frankie Valli talking about. You have your life on the road and you have your life at home. They're very parallel. They never meet. So I think that was still 100% going on, that there was still some debauchery, but there was, by that time, a lot of established relationships with women, and that there was more established relationships and more denial by the women in locally in Seattle that, oh, I miss Haunt, that which, that they pretty much like were trying to establish their territory. I'm like, yeah, you and three other women just in this town. I'm not going to freak you out and tell you about the women out there on the road that I knew about as well, because let's face it, even Courtney Love started out as a groupie. Let's fucking face it. And she's still a groupie at heart, which God love her for that. So just because, these women in Seattle had different established identities, false or true, doesn't mean that they were any less groupie than we were. They were just like the 70s girls calling them muses. Like, bullshit, what song was written about you besides Sweet Sweet Connie? And Baby Buell, yeah, because I love that song. But anyway, so, but I think that, as the 70s were calling themselves muses, the Seattle women were calling themselves girlfriends. And Eddie Vedder even married a model. People still... Chris Cornell broke up with his manager, wife, girlfriend to marry a model. So were they really different from the 70s, 80s, or 80s groupies or rockers? Absolutely not. Just the attitude, the approach. Becoming a groupie was still a very welcomed event in the 90s. It was still, a natural draw to the women, and you could still get a little bit of TNA in the back lounge, so was it really different? No. But was it kind of in a limbo and you felt that? Yes. For me, a groupie in the 90s, like I said, I was very established. I already knew Metallica for years. I already knew Megadeth for a lot of years. I already knew, Pearl Jam and had already been in Seattle once before, so I knew Alice in Chains. I was at the show that they got signed at, so it was just very, very a different approach by the men and the women. And those of us who were still having a good time were kind of not necessarily like, we definitely were not ostracized by any means, but we were kind of like the Karens clutching their pearl when you walked backstage. Because I always talk about that night with Pantera backstage, that everybody and anybody was backstage. Out of every Seattle band you've ever heard of, there was somebody, or not, if not everybody in that band there. So there was also girlfriends and wives and other, groupies for local bands that came along with their lovers. But we were the ones, me and Andrea, while we were just having a blast, minding our own business, we could feel that going across the room from Susan Silver, from the other women and stuff. Was Chris already? No, I think they were still together. From, different band members' girlfriends. Except for Kim's. Kim's girlfriend was totally cool with us. She knew who we were. We had met her before on the scene. So, still a groupie scene. Still cool to be a groupie. But I think the hedonism still kind of mellowed out. But still was in that transition to sex is bad, we cannot have fun anymore, laughter type of early 2000s, the heroin chic and the depression era for the groupies. And I was a groupie in the 2000s, obviously. Woke up next to, when did John pass away? June 27, 2002. And I know my book ends in 2002. Like, I really don't talk about, there's a couple chapters that talk about have pictures, but I was still being a groupie. So, but it was, again, it was a totally different ballgame, and you could see it dwindling in 2000s as it was kind of dwindling in the 1990s. You know, girls, it was something they did for a semester in college, or something they did before they settled down with their current husband and started their other life path, you know. So it was that weird kind of limbo before the early 2000s, but you know what, let's upswing it again. I think, you know, things come and go in trends, and I think it's a great trend to bring back, because rock and roll needs a little less corporate restriction and a hell of a lot more laughter these days. Because, I mean, think of all the cool songs that came out of it. You know, even Andrew Wood, his stripper girlfriend. Because I think in the 90s, supporting your boyfriend as a stripper and a groupie, you know, as your starving musician boyfriend, was more prevalent as well. As to where in the 80s it kind of started, but it was more kind of like, not an authoritarian figure being the woman that supported you, the musician, because I think in the 90s, if you were the girlfriend that was supporting your musician, you kind of had a little more authoritarian attitude towards it. You know, you put your foot down a hell of a lot more. So, but there you guys go. There is my take on being a groupie in the 90s. Ladies, if you were a groupie in the 90s, get down in that description. Let's talk about it. Tell me what you thought. If you started out in the 80s and went into the 90s, tell me what you thought that transition was. Tell me how it was different for you. Let's start a discussion, because, you know, life after 70s, despite what, no matter what Pamela DeBars wants to say, and she keeps saying this again and again and again in interviews, even recently. The groupie scene died after the 70s. There was no real groupie scene. It was just a bunch of dark drug whores in the 80s. Oh, fuck you, bitch. You know, so it's time for us to tell our own story, because it didn't die in the 70s, honey. We just gave it a whole new fucking name and look and ball game. We gave it the much refreshed the refreshing it needed in the 80s. We were not doormats. And in the 90s, and even in the 2000s, there's still a groupie scene. So let's talk about it. Let's get it going again, ladies. Down in that description. And if you're just hanging out and discovering me, join the party. Join the family. We got a lot of really cool people here. We're all just about the music and our love of life and our experiences, whether it be in LA or New York or Fargo or Salt Lake City or, you know, South America or Europe, London. It's so great to hear everybody's stories. And like I said, I'm getting back to everyone's comments little by little. Thank you so much for your patience. So hit that subscribe, you guys. Join the family. Let's grow it, grow it, grow it. We're slowly growing, and I love it. We're getting closer to 10,000. That's kind of my goal. After that, everything is cake. So go down there, show, you know, because I do want producers looking at this, because I do want to sell my book for the purchase rights for a movie or a series. And so show them that there is interest, because they are looking at that. Show through the likes and through the comments. I appreciate that. Watch the commercials, you know, because that helps get me out to the algorithm for the advertisers. So yeah, let's get it out here. Let's show the producers, let's show people just kind of stumbling on that this is something that we all want to see. Not just my story, but everybody's story. Not just the rest of the girls in my clique, but everybody else's stories that happen that can identify, because I definitely think if this gets signed for a book or a movie deal, or excuse me, a series or a movie deal, I think the series that they would incorporate a lot of LA, because you kind of have to. Even though, you know, it's Salt Lake City and there were different, it's my story. My story isn't LA, but I think LA has to be incorporated into that, because it was in New York and the big cities that were big parts of the scene back then. So definitely put your experiences down there. It may end up on the show, who knows? So, all right, hit the subscribe, hit the share, hit my bells, and we'll see you next time on Cocktails and Rocktails. Cheers, big ears.